Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior professional and a respected coach from Ottawa, Canada, Sharon McLaughlin. Sharon, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Sharon is a leadership coach and HR and change leadership advisor. So Sharon, my first question, after 30 years leading HR and corporate services and municipal government, what have you learned about why people resist change?
Well, the number one thing I feel that people resist and change is they feel that it's being done to them. They're losing control. And they usually make stories that really aren't always true because they're not in control of the conversation. So they want to be involved. Once they get the information, it's usually not as bad as they thought it was. And they tend to move through it at a different pace.
What is the biggest mistake you have observed leaders make when they're planning to communicate organizational change?
When they're planning to communicate or when they're planning to go through organizational change, they focus on the outcome. They focus on the goal. They focus on that go live date or that new policy, new initiative. But they don't stop to think about the individuals that are transitioning through the change and what their experience is, because they're usually ahead of the change. They're the idea makers or the approvers. So they're one step ahead of individuals. And they communicate less when they should be communicating more.
Very interesting. Why do some organizations become highly adaptable while others struggle with every change effort?
I think I'll narrow it down to a culture. When you are in a culture that does not do change well, you're going to struggle. If you focus on people, focus on the individuals going through change rather than the outcome, you will have better results. When your people are happy and confident with the change, they'll do the work for you.
How should leaders balance empathy with accountability during periods of disruption?
Well, I struggle with that because it comes natural to me. And I am an empathetic person and also a very accountable person. So there's a balance of getting the work done, but bringing people with you. So it's not as much of you need to be you need to give direction, but not be authoritative to a negative. So bringing your people along with you, understand that people don't go through change at the same pace. Some people may go through that change curve longer and slower than other individuals because we're all different. So it's balancing getting the work done, but taking the time with those individuals that you need to for that extra support.
Well said.
And yeah, not so much looking at the end goal, but looking at the individuals as you're going through.
Well said. Sharon, you say that meaningful change begins within. What does this mean in practical terms? And give me an example if you can.
It means that as people go through change, to go through that change successfully, you need to be confident in yourself.
Mm.
And confident in yourself is knowing where you're going, what you want to accomplish, who you are. I talk about that in terms of career transition, um, and leading other people through change. You need to know what your strengths are. You need to be very in tune with emotional intelligence to know how you're coming across to individuals, to have a successful communication of that new change, or to go be successful in going through that career transition to get to where you want to be yourself.
Great response. Why do successful leaders struggle when they face personal or career transitions?
They're losing their identity.
Mm.
You know, the work to go through a career transition needs to start before. You need to know where you're going.
Mm.
So those that are successful, have that path. The path is where they want it to go.
Mm.
Where people struggle is when they might face an unexpected career transition. Maybe it's a corporate reorganization, something they didn't expect. Then they're going to struggle because,
Right.
again, same as what we were talking about earlier, that is a change that is thrust upon them, not that they're in control of. So the ones that are successful know themselves, know what they're good at, what their interests, what their values are, and they build their career transition search around that. They know exactly who they are and what they are, where they would be successful, and they target those in their career search.
And is it just uncertainty or insecurity, or is it also the fear of the unknown?
Oh, absolutely, the fear of the unknown, and it goes to being in control of yourself. Everyone likes to control their own environment. Really, people don't like to be told what to do in their own life. So it is their life. And it's the fear of the unknown in that of, okay, where am I going to end up? And there's many different reasons for that fear of the unknown, from family reasons and those they support as well as themselves. There's lots of factors to that, but getting certain and grounded and brings a little back that control, that sense of control, so you can focus outwardly and more confidently.
Amazing. Sharon, you're also a coach and a well-respected coach. What are some of the common fears you have seen leaders bring into their coaching conversations?
Right now, I'm seeing a lot of emerging leaders getting into new roles. The world has changed, and people are stepping into leadership roles that they're not quite prepared for. So they want to look good. They want to be respective. They got into this role. They're supposed to know what they're doing. Well, those fears are, I guess, a little bit, you call it imposter syndrome of, okay, how am I going to handle this situation? How are we, am I going to know what I'm going to do in this situation? So they, again, it goes back to the fear of the unknown, right? They don't have all the answers. They're most likely used to being an individual contributor that got to a leadership role based on their experience. They were a very successful person as an individual contributor. Now they're stepping into this new role of people leadership, and they're They don't have all the answers anymore because we're human
Mm,
and every situation is different. So I'm seeing that a lot. Um, it's once you've been in leadership longer,
mm,
those situations don't necessarily um, frighten you as much.
mm.
But those emerging leaders, and there's a lot of emerging leaders right now
Mm,
because the workforce is changing
correct.
and people are moving into roles quicker
Yeah,
than before.
absolutely. And tell me, how can leaders distinguish between a temporary setback and a signal that it is time for a major career change?
Mhm. That comes from within.
Mm,
I think I'll say reading the room
mm,
and reading the situation. I truly believe that when it's time, and experienced individuals um, don't. I'll say they can feel that,
mm,
and they don't leave themselves in situations that may um, jeopardize that.
mm,
Temporary setback can be a bad day, right? You don't make a harsh decision on a bad day,
mm,
but when there's accumulation of those bad days,
mm,
then that turns into a signal for sure.
mm.
And I think the
Absolutely.
individuals knowing themselves and knowing where they want to go and what their values are, what
Correct.
they're right, and that's why I say it comes from within for sure.
Mm. And how can a leader develop greater self awareness without becoming overly self critical?
I do a lot of work with leaders on emotional intelligence. We use that as a basis of our coaching programs, and I also use Gallup Clifton Strengths. So it depends on where you want to lead
Mm,
into. Someone going through a career transition that may be in that I'll say setback stage, that stage that they're not sure um, of themselves because their world has been rocked.
mm,
Gallup Clifton Strengths, I use that in my coaching practice, and it indicates what your strengths are. I know it was very pivotal in my career many years ago when I took that for the first time and realized
mm,
that's who I am, right? So um, there's many conversations through coaching to understand who you are as an individual, what your values are, and what you're good at, and that what skills you like, and that really gives you a sense of who you are.
mm,
Coming away with that, with saying, okay, I have an example. I coached a, a teacher who had very from a very young age knew they wanted to be a teacher, but raised through the ranks and was now a principal,
mm,
and they weren't really happy. They were good at it, so there's a difference between being good at it and who you are.
mm.
And at the end of the day, they wanted to go back to being a teacher because that's who they were.
Yeah,
So doing some of that work helps individuals get a sense of who they are really.
very interesting. Moving on, Sharon, AI is now all pervasive in every organization. What, in your view, are the biggest workforce challenges organization will face in the next decade, given the presence of AI?
Well, AI is a tool. It's uh, an automation, but we still are humans,
Hmm.
and that worries me. Is that as we introduce more AI, we are losing that human connection. And I think that is a challenge. We're talking about leadership. Leadership is human, and leading people will always be a human role. And learning how to interact with coworkers in the workplace is needs to be top of mind. We need to use AI in our work to make us better and fill those gaps that we all know we have in the workforce today. But we cannot go away from that human connection. Coaching is going to be very prevalent. I think back of when I was young in my career, we were all in the workforce. We were all in office buildings, and we had a lot of, I'll say, coaching and mentoring. Where now, with the dispersed workforce, there's less than that. So it's going to be very critical, I think, in the coming years of maintaining that coaching, mentoring, and that human connection.
Amazing. What leadership capabilities are becoming more important in today's workplace, not only with technology, but with such a diverse work habit kind of system, working from home, hybrid working, partially in office, and so on and so forth?
Yes. The leadership skill is emotional intelligence is very important. Being able to, not only from the perspective of knowing yourself, but more so from knowing other individuals. Not everybody works the same. Not everyone is wired to work alone in their home office and need that interaction. So knowing individuals of what they need and being able to read the room is very important. Being able to help those individuals as they go through that change curve. There's so much change happening in organizations today that people can't keep up, and some people struggle with layering change upon change upon change. So slowing down and pacing the initiatives and making sure that your team is going along with you in those initiatives are critical to leaders today, and will be as we introduce more and more change over the next years. We're in a very pivotal time right now in the workforce, and if we're not careful, there's such a thing as change saturation. Right, and that leads to change fatigue, and that leads to disengagement, and that leads to people being very unhappy or sick in the workplace. So we need to be very careful with that, for sure.
Very interesting. What does great leadership look like in a world where change is the only constant?
Great leadership looks like human-centered leadership. So we're introducing more and more change. The amount of change that workers are experiencing today compared to even 10 years ago is tremendous, tremendously higher. And leaders today need to be aware of that and aware of individuals as they go through it. They need to have a vision, share their vision, give space for people to talk it through and ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
Make that safe environment that they feel safe, that they can
Mm-hmm.
ask questions. Communicate in different ways. Often there may be an individual on your team that you have to meet individually because they take a longer time to go through that change curve. So
Mm-hmm.
just to be aware that people go through change differently and pace things out. Be aware of when there's a lot going on, that people tend to struggle more when there's a lot going on,
Mm-hmm.
and plan your projects and your initiatives and your, as much as you can, your workload to reflect that.
Great response. Sharon, I have time for two more questions. Is there a belief about leadership that you once held strongly, but have since changed your mind?
Mhm. I think back many years ago, I looked at the leaders and leaders above me, and I thought, um, wow, they got to that role because they're a good leader.
Mm.
And I now feel that leadership is is in you. It's not in everyone.
Mm.
And some people get into roles not because they're a good leader. Some individuals, everyone's motivated by different things. So some individuals get into leadership roles for the money or the status, or they have, climbed that ladder and this is the next step.
Mm.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a good leader or a great leader if you're sitting in an executive seat or a supervisor seat or a manager seat. So I think that, when I was first, a long time ago,
Yeah.
when I was first starting out, I thought that all leaders were great
Mm.
because um, they had raised through the ranks and they made it into that seat. But that's not the case.
Absolutely.
And you need to be very conscious of um, your brand or your experience, the
Mm.
experience you give individuals. And leadership is a very important and privileged role to be leading a group of individuals.
Absolutely. Well said. And my last question to you, Sharon. If you could leave one piece of advice for my viewers and leaders, my listeners, and for the next generation of leaders, what would it be?
I would say be confident.
Mm-hmm.
You're new to that role. You're not expected to know it all,
Mm.
and ask for help when you need it,
Mm.
but be human. If you are experiencing some uncertainty and some doubt,
Mm.
um, the individual beneath you or beside you is also experiencing doubt on something else. And get out of, the meetings, have some one-to-one conversations, get to know people, and they will, build trust in you.
Mm.
And then the leadership part comes easier when there's that connection and they know the real you. Um, and they then build some trust with you and will go along with you.
Mm. Absolutely. And on that note and your amazing advice, be confident, ask for help, and be human. Thank you, Sharon, for speaking to me about your amazing perspectives on leadership. I think we covered a lot of interesting ground, which I'm sure my viewers and listeners would really value. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.